All right, this is the question we get asked a lot, and a lot of people wonder, can you save money tying flies? Well, guess what? Today, we will find out.
That's a big brown throw.
All right, let me preface this whole thing with, I realize we don't tie flies to save money. And throughout this video, I'm going to probably repeat that many times. The goal is not to save money. For me, I like to tie flies because I find it relaxing. I like to be able to dial in exactly what I put into my flies for different functionality, different colors, different sizes. Just overall enjoyment of the sport. Having the ability to tie flies, say in the middle of a snowstorm when I might not be out fishing, is a great way for me to enjoy the sport without actually being out there. So with that said, we don't need to fill up the comments with a bunch of, you can't save money and that's not the goal. Correct, that is not the goal. But if it is your goal, or if more than anything, you want to know where that break-even point is, I'm going to get to that towards the end of the video. We'll actually show you the numbers, and I'll talk to you about how you would go about if you wanted to save money and what are some of the considerations to go down that path. So we're going to start off, and just heads up, I have my crib notes here. I'm not going to memorize all these numbers, but I have gone through and I've vetted all of the costs. I've vetted kind of what you're going to be looking at in terms of what your return would be and where that break-even point would be. Again, there's a lot of assumptions here. We're just making this very simple. So let's get to it. All right. To begin with, we're going to go over some ground rules, and these are going to be some kind of big assumptions that I'm going to throw out there that we just have to do to kind of put on an equal standpoint for everybody to look at. You may or may not agree with my approach, and if you have a different approach, in other words, if you want to go a lot cheaper with this break-even point would come a lot quicker for you. I'm not going to go down that path. I'm going to go with a reasonable starting point, so we're talking a reasonable vise, some reasonable tools, and then materials to get you started with a few specific flies, and that's part of what we're going to do. Also, and this is a big disclaimer, I'm not going to count the time it takes to tie the flies. Everybody's going to value their time differently. And as I stated before, the intent is not to save money tying flies, but instead have a hobby that we can enjoy. So I would say any time you spend at the hobby is probably not time lost. You're doing it as an enjoyment factor. So I am not counting the cost of your labor into these. However, if you were a commercial fly tyer, you absolutely 100% would want to calculate that in, because that would help you gauge whether it's going to be better for you to flip burgers at McDonald's or sit down at the vise and tie flies. So certainly real considerations, but we're throwing that one out because labor cost is going to vary. It'll be all over the board depending on what you do and how you think about it. So that's going to be the main starting point there. But also, so we're talking decent materials, decent tools. We're not counting our time as an investment. And then one little word on sunk costs. If you were to just start out, and let's say you went and bought your tools and your vise, and we'll go through that and you'll see the numbers here in a little bit. I am probably not going to, every time I sit down, calculate what fraction of the cost of this fly is attributed to my vise. But what I will do is I will just say, to begin with, we're going to get the basics and everything that we need to get started, and that's going to figure into the cost. But if I'm looking at this 2 years down the road, most likely your vise should last you 2 years. So whatever we're tying 2 years from now, there's a fraction of that vise that's going to go into that cost. I don't necessarily care about that. I'm going to chalk it up as a sunk cost because it's something I spent. I'm not going to really make it back unless I start selling flies, which I'm not going to do. But if you wanted to go down that path, and if you were going to be a commercial tyer, that's one way to look at it. You would want to break down those costs and build them into your future decisions in terms of tools and materials and anything else you may want to spend. Enough said. Let's get down to the numbers. So we're just going to start off starting with a basic kit, so to speak, that we're going to build to help you get started with the tying of the flies. Okay, the other thing that we're going to do is, because hooks are typically sold in packs of more than one, we're going to tie these in dozens. So if you're dealing with a pack of hooks that's 25, we'll just say that's a dozen. If you really wanted to get nerdy about this, you could sit down and kind of calculate an average cost per hook. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to throw out some different hooks and different materials based on the cost that you would expect to spend at any fly shop or wherever you buy them. So I'm going to start off with a lower end Renzetti Traveler. And it's going to range depending on where you get it and what specific options you have. Let's say around 210 bucks. I think a good vise is an investment regardless of whether you expect to spend a lot of time tying. I think people probably most quickly upgrade their vise if they go with kind of the sub $150 vise. I think you'll tend to wear that thing out, and I wouldn't view that as a very wise investment. If you are on the fence and don't know if you want to tie flies, I just recommend borrowing one. But for our example here, we're going to spend a little over $200 on the vise. Now, I'm going to put together some tools, and again, the links for all these as options. I'm not going to name specifics, but you can find the links to the products that are applicable down below. And again, this is somewhat of a little bit of an estimate because the prices could change. There could be different tools that you prefer. Okay, so the tools we're going to start off with are just kind of a basic package of tools for the two flies we're going to tie. Number one is going to be a zebra midge, and number two, a beadhead pheasant tail. Arguably very simple nymphs, but very useful, and they can be used in a lot of different scenarios. So on my tools, I'm going with the bare minimum of tools that I need for these two flies. And that's part of the approach here is we're going to incrementally purchase tools. With the vise and the tools, you're looking at about $250 total. Again, that's going to be a range. And then one side note here when it comes to kits. I'm a big fan of fly tying kits as long as it's not overkill for what you need. And then also, I don't like the kits so much that have a lot of materials into them because you're essentially paying for materials that you may not ever use. And you're also likely paying for materials that are not the best quality or maybe the specific color that you want. So my approach when building a kit like this, when we're just going to start out and make this nerdy Mythbuster experiment here, is let's just focus only on the materials and the tools that we need to tie the flies we're going to focus on. So with that, we're also going to throw in some hooks. And in this case, I've just chosen some very simple Firehole 609 nymph hooks because they can be used in a variety of different nymph patterns. They're also a mid-price point hook. So you're not super cheap hooks, but you're also not going to be super expensive. And again, you could mess with these numbers if you can buy hooks in bulk, and there's all sorts of considerations if you really, really want to save money. Okay, from there, we're going to add a couple of spools of thread because we're dealing with two flies. We're going to deal with some pheasant tail, some beads, a couple of spools of wire, and some peacock herl. So again, these are all going to be listed below. But if we throw the materials in there, we're looking at now around $280 of investment that I've spent. I've gone to the shop, picked up all the materials, all the tools, everything, the vise that I need. And I will hopefully, once I learn how to do those, walk away with 2 dozen flies, 1 dozen each zebra midge, and then the beadhead pheasant tail. Now, here's where the comparison comes in. So I've spent that money, I've spent that time, I've got 2 dozen flies. In exchange, if I had just gone to the local fly shop and forked over some cash to buy some flies, those same flies would cost me, and again, these are going to vary, but we're just going to use an average value, $2.75 for a fly. I know for a lot of people that could be expensive. For some are saying, oh, that's kind of cheap depending on where you are and what flies you're dealing with. However, we're just going to take an average. I know our average, we sell thousands of flies. Our average selling price, the ones the most popular, is $2.75. So I'm just doing a formula there. Okay, so what you've got now is you've got $280 out of pocket versus really $66 in fly costs. If we're looking at that from that point, well, that's a no-brainer. It's way more expensive to tie your own flies. And again, we're talking apples to apples here. For the exact same fly pattern, buying it versus tying it, way more expensive. Now, let me throw in another mix here, and we're going to tie some different types of flies. And again, and this is, I think, how you should approach it, even if you're just getting started and not looking to save money, but we're going to be incremental. And in this case, we're going to tie 2 more flies. We've got an elk-hair caddis and a parachute Adams. Again, those are like arguably 2 of the most popular dry fly patterns out there, okay? So you go to any fly shop or sporting goods store in the world and you can buy these 2 patterns. So if we're going to tie them, now what we're adding is a pack of barbless dry fly hooks. And this is a 50 pack. This is the example. I'm using fulling mill. We're paying $13 or so for 50 hooks, which is actually a pretty good deal on the fulling mill. I will have to buy a hair stacker. So that's one additional tool for around $8. Again, that can fluctuate. And I'm going to also now need, in addition to the materials that I have, I'll need another spool of thread. I'm going to need some hackle, which is kind of a big deal for some people. I'm going to add 2 packs of dubbing, some wing post, and some deer hair. If I throw those new materials in and the additional hair stacker and hooks, that additional 2 patterns that I'm tying is going to cost me another $70. Now, again, if I'm looking at my vise and the tools that I've purchased as kind of a sunk cost, but I'm not in our scenario. I'm going to roll them into, and we're going to see where we land with that. And then just as before we look at those numbers, again, I just want to emphasize the goal here is not to save money, but the goal, especially if you want to minimize your costs, not save money, what I'm telling you, and these are good tips, is you're getting started to kind of add to your fly tying collection a little bit at a time based on the patterns that you may be tying. So now where this goes off the rails, and I mean this for me because it happened to me, and I know talking to a lot of people, you're not saving money here. So what you might end up doing, eventually you'll probably end up buying things that you use just on a couple of patterns. And if you don't tie, say, a dozen or 2 dozen of that pattern, now you've got 99% of a bag of dubbing that's sitting there unused. Okay, again, we're not going to get into those nitty-gritty details, but that's kind of where things go off the rails. Another thing that I've seen people do, myself included, is I will rebuy. So I may have this spool of thread, let's say a Semperfli 12-aught in red. Well, maybe I have one and I didn't see it. I went and bought another one. So there's going to be some things that complicate. So these are things you may want to keep a lookout as you're doing your fly tying, is to watch out for those little gotchas. So it's a good idea to keep track of what you have, maybe keep the inventory of what you have readily visible so you know what you have and don't have and what you need to buy. Okay, in addition to that, one of the big things that I think that we all tend to do is we like to be wowed by cool new tools. And the cooler the tool, often the more expensive they can be. So if you are the kind of person that says, I want that $50 chip clip or whatever that tool may be, and you want to buy that, again, who cares if it's going to have a payback? But I'm just saying, as you start to look at whether you're saving money in this, which you're not, you tend to want to be careful with the tools you buy because those will add up fast. But again, those are just little things, simple reminders. I don't keep track of those so much. I like to be organized. I like to tie my own flies for those other reasons. So if that were the case, if it was purely about saving money, I probably wouldn't go to, I probably wouldn't go to an $800 vise and a $50 dubbing twister or some such. But with that said, now we're going to really ramp up the nerdery here, and we're going to look at what point, because there is a point that we're going to break even, and I'm going to show that to you in a little bit. But let's take the next step up. So now we're talking 4 dozen flies at a total retail cost of $132. So I've got a dozen zebra midges, beadhead pheasant tails, parachute Adams, and an elk hair caddis. Those are the dozen of each that I have, 4 dozen. I've shelled out now total $132 if I were to go to buy those for myself at a fly shop or wherever. Now, total with materials, tools, and my vise and everything that I've invested, materially speaking, I am at a grand total of $350. So still very expensive to tie my own flies. But again, I'm dealing with only 4 dozen flies. I don't know too many people that only fish with 4 dozen flies. So we're not going to call the game complete at this point. We're going to go further. Now you can kind of see what's happening is those sunk costs, which we'll say our tools and the vise are, and to some extent some of those materials, but I can still consume the materials and may have to purchase more of them. Now, let's go one step up. Let's double that. So now I've tied a total of 8 dozen flies. Now, keep in mind, these are the same 4 flies. The realistic part of this is that I probably am not tying 5 dozen of each pattern that I ever want to tie. With that said, I would recommend, as you tie a pattern, especially to learn, that you tie them in dozens. So a pheasant tail, in order for you to get really good at that, and in order for them to look the same and have the same level of quality, in other words, they're not going to come untied or they're not going to bust open as you fish them, you want to tie them nicely, uniformly, and that will happen with practice. And the way you get practice is by tying more and more. So We're going to double this. We're now at 8 dozen. My retail cost for those would be $264. Now, if I'm going to, in this case, I'm just buying 2 more or additional hooks to account for that. Now my cost on the tying my own is $370 compared to the $264. So now I'm still ahead of the game if I were buying them myself, or buying them rather than tying them, but we're catching up. So now let's go again. Let's add 4 more dozen, and this is where we hit our coveted break-even point. So if everybody's wanting to know what the break-even point is, and this is a break-even point again. These are estimates, but you'll see the concept here. 12 dozen flies, so 144 flies, let's say a dozen of each of those, or 3 dozen of each of those 4 kinds that I've talked about. Now we're talking retail is around $400, $396 if I were to go and buy those flies. Now on the fly tying side, I am just over $400. So that around 12 dozen, again, if we're right down the line of those patterns that I talked about, I am at a break-even point. In other words, if I go down to the shop and I buy a dozen or 2 dozen more hooks and I tie 2 dozen more flies, and let's say 4 dozen, because I'm going to end it with this number, 16 dozen flies, the same one, so let's say 4 dozen of each, $528 retail of the flies. If I were to just buy those flies, if I just got the additional hooks and assuming the materials will still last, which they will for this many, I'm not going to run out of any of those materials really. Beads, probably, but I've only got one that needs beads. I am now at $430. So around 12 dozen is where that flip-flops. So strategically speaking, can you save money on tying your own flies? Absolutely you can. Do I want to save money tying my own flies? Absolutely I don't. And I like to tie flies because that's what I like to do. Now everybody's different. You may be sitting out there, I just want to save money, or especially if you're going to be a commercial tire and you want to sell some, this is good stuff because it's going to help you drive, whether it makes sense for you to flip burgers at McDonald's, like I said, or tie flies and try to sell them. So where do we stand? Again, if you want to save money, you can by tying your own flies. But again, the biggest part of tying flies is the enjoyment. It's a de-stressor, and it's a way for you to really dial in those flies exactly how you want, the colors you want, the sizes that you want, the functionality that you want. And if you want to spend $800 on a vise, knock yourself out, that's fine. What for somebody, a $200 vise may be expensive. For somebody else, $800 vise may be super cheap. It's all relative. We're just in, this is all fishing at the end of the day. We want to have fun. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in our comment section below. Check out the links. Check us out at flyfishfood.com and enjoy the tying most of all.